When you think of the teleological argument, what is likely to come to your mind is an inductive or abductive argument, where it is established that the most likely or best explanation of the order in our world is that there is a God who designs it. The most famous example of this emerges from William Paley in the 18th century, who gives the analogy of a watchmaker. When we observe a watch, we readily infer based on the complexity of this watch that it did not come into existence by accident, but rather there was likely an intelligent and skilled watchmaker who created it through intentional handiwork. This is not to say that a watch cannot come into being by chance, but instead to say that this is improbable. Paley then compares this to the complexity we find in the natural world, such as living things, and concludes that these things are likely to have come about by means of an intelligent designer. However, there is a deductive variation of the teleological argument that has not received so much attention. This argument was formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae. He explains, "We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, did they achieve their end. Now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God." To understand this argument, we must first institute the notion of final causality. This concept dates back to Aristotle's famous doctrine of the four causes, which are the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and lastly the final cause. The latter two are the causes that will be considered here. An efficient cause refers to the thing that brings another into being. So, for example, the actions of the machines in a factory are said to be the efficient cause of the containers manufactured there. This is contrasted with the final cause, which is the end or goal of a thing. So, for example, the container's storing of food and other items is said to be the final cause of the container. The reason this doctrine is so important is because it is what St. Thomas is referencing when he states that things such as natural bodies act for an end. He is saying that natural agents, or those natural things which are efficient causes, have a final cause. But why think that final causes exist for natural agents? There are a few reasons. The first is, as St. Thomas suggests here, is that we observe things which lack intelligence, which is what it means to be natural, act always in the same way, or nearly in the same way, as to obtain the best results. If a heart is not directed towards pumping blood, then how do we explain the fact that a heart normally does pump blood, as opposed to helping to digest food? If fire is not directed towards warming things, how do we explain the fact that fire normally does warm things, as opposed to freezing them? As the philosopher Feser explains, for Aquinas, the fact that A regularly brings about B, as B's efficient cause, entails that bringing about B is in turn the final cause of A. For if we did not suppose that A inherently points to or is directed towards the generation of B as its natural end, then we would have no way to account for the fact that A typically does generate B specifically, rather than C or D or E, or indeed, rather than no effect at all. This is why efficient causation seems to be unintelligible, absent final causation. Secondly, if natural agents do not have final causes, then we cannot say that they have failed to satisfy their purpose. For example, if an eye fails to allow for vision, then in what regard would this be a failure of the eye, given that it lacks any orientation towards an end or purpose? But it is evident that natural agents do fail, and thus they must have an end. Thirdly, positing that they do provides a solution to David Hume's problem of induction. In the 18th century, Hume asks how we can rationally justify making conclusions about the future based on past observations. How can we know that the sun will rise again tomorrow? Aristotle gives us an answer. The Earth, as other natural agents, has a final end, to rotate in order to receive light from the sun, and therefore we know that it will rotate and we will see the sun rise. But are these ends really causes? Could it be perhaps that they are merely ends? We can see that this is not the case by observing that an agent's causal power is characterized by these ends. For example, a flame's causal power being that to burn rubber is characterized by this end. There is a directedness between the thing as an efficient cause and its end which makes it intelligible. Therefore, it is evident that final causes are a real feature of natural agents. Now that we have established that natural agents, or at least some natural agents, which is sufficient for the argument, have final causes, we can now proceed to the second stage of the argument, that it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, did they achieve their end. Now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. We can see his motivation for affirming that intelligence is necessary for such ends and goals to exist, by recognizing that for anything to be causally efficacious, i.e., to have the ability to act as a cause, it must exist in some way. The ends of these agents cannot exist in reality, otherwise we would reach a vicious circle, whereby the cause in reality causes the agent to reach the cause existing in reality. It would be as if saying that the oak tree in reality causes the acorn to become the oak tree in reality, which is evidently absurd. However, it is possible that the goal exists in the intellect. For example, a builder's form of a house in his intellect can cause him to reach the goal of building this house in reality before it is in reality. Therefore, for things to act towards an end, the ends must exist in some intelligence which directs the agent towards its end. This intelligence will of course be external to the natural agents around us, given that they are not intelligent agents. But note that this intelligence must also exist here and now with the natural agents. This is made clear by the fact that if it were not here with them, they would cease to have their ends. But they do have their ends, and thus the intelligence exists here with them. What this means is that they cannot merely depend on this intelligence in order to begin, but rather they are dependent on it at every moment in which they exist. So, just as in a series of a stone being moved by a stick on a hand, every member of this series continually depends on the prior member, and will cease if one of their prior members ceases. This is what we call a per se, or essentially ordered series. Now, one consideration to note is that a natural agent can, to some degree, direct another, such as a body directing the organs. But this is only instrumentally, through an intellect, as this would direct the body towards its final cause of directing the organs. Now, such a series must terminate with a first member. This is true given that every agent, as explained prior, depends on its prior member to be directed towards its end, and so on. If it were to extend ad infinitum, then none of the members would be causally efficacious when spoken of in and of themselves, because they would lack such directedness towards their final end of causing the next member without the prior members. Consequently, none would be able to direct another, because they would all lack such power. None of the members could be instrumentally directed by their prior member, given the prior member too would lack this ability, and so on. Therefore, there would be no series at all, because there would be no directing, and so there must be a first cause of this series, which is intelligent. As St. Thomas concludes, all ordering, therefore, is necessarily affected by means of the wisdom of a being endowed with intelligence. This is what we call the supreme intellect. Now, this supreme intellect must be too such that it is pure act, meaning its essence, i.e. what it is identical with its existence, i.e. that it is. This is because, as Garrigou-Lagrange explains, therefore, we have demonstrated that an intellect of pure act directs all of the natural agents around us, which is what we call God. What also follows from this is that it cannot merely be a very high intellect, but rather be omniscient, because it would be the fullness of intellect, as shown by the fact that it would be the fullness of being. We can present this argument deductively as follows. Premise 1. All natural agents with a final cause must be directed by an intellect. Premise 2. Natural agents exist that have final causes. Premise 3. Therefore, natural agents with their final cause directed by an intellect exists. Premise 4. This leads to an essentially ordered series of agents being directed. Premise 5. Either this series extends ad infinitum, or it terminates with a supreme intellect. Premise 6. It cannot extend ad infinitum, because this would mean that there is no agents being directed in the series. Premise 7. Therefore, this series terminates with a supreme intellect. Premise 8. This supreme intellect must be pure act. Conclusion. Therefore, a supreme intellect that is pure act exists, which is what we call God. This argument is superior to Paley's teleological argument in that it is deductive rather than inductive, meaning that it guarantees the existence of God. It also avoids the objection of biological evolution, and also what has been called the God of the gaps objection. If you like this video and would like to see more content like this, then please make sure to subscribe, and if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments. May God bless you all.